Welcome back to Spirits in the Shadow. Tonight, we're going to explore a horror story that's been circulating online, supposedly based on a real-life incident that took place in the winding, foggy alleys of Bongcheon-dong, Seoul. The story begins with a desperate chase, but the real horror comes when the footsteps stop. Imagine this. You're pressed against the wall, trying to catch your breath, but the footsteps behind you keep coming. You hear breathing that isn't yours. What was chasing someone in that alley? Join me in finding out. If you like scary stories like this, be sure to subscribe. Now, let's get started. My name's Min Jun. I was just another 21-year-old literature major, drowning in textbooks and caffeine. That's not a metaphor, it's a diagnosis. My world had shrunk to the size of a library carrel. My diet consisted of stale convenience store kimbap and lukewarm Americanos. And my primary relationship was with the looming spectre of my graduation thesis. The grand, romanticized world of poetry and prose I had signed up for had been distilled into a relentless grind of deadlines, footnotes, and the oppressive, humming silence of the university's main library. I lived near Bongcheon Station, a quiet residential area south of Seoul that felt a world away from the frantic energy of the campus. It was a neighborhood of modest, aging apartment buildings, family-run noodle shops that had been there for decades, and streets that grew quiet and still long before the rest of the city slept. It was home, but getting there felt like a commute between two different countries. Most nights, I was the last one to leave the literature wing. The security guard, Mr. Kim, would give me a familiar, weary nod as I pushed through the heavy glass doors. The sudden rush of cool night air, a welcome shock to my system. By then, it was usually around 1 a.m. The campus was a ghost town, the manic energy of the day replaced by the lonely glow of streetlights on empty pathways. The walk home alone was a ritual, a period of decompression where my brain slowly shifted gears from analyzing 19th century syntax to the simple, primal need for sleep. The main roads took 25 minutes, a straight, predictable shot down wide, brightly lit boulevards. It was the safe route, the sensible route. It was also sterile and mind-numbingly dull. The storefronts were all shuttered, their neon signs turned off, and the only company was the occasional late-night bus hissing past, its windows mostly empty. It felt like walking through a scale model of a city rather than the real thing. But I'd found something better, a network of secret shortcuts slicing through old apartment complexes, back stairways, and fog-filled alleys. This was my secret knowledge, my personal map of the city's hidden veins. It wasn't a single path, but a fluid, interconnected web that I had pieced together over 3 years of late-night journeys. A sharp right turn behind a 24-hour laundromat, a duck under a low-hanging pipe, a climb up a set of concrete stairs that serviced the back of a row of villas. It was a route that shaved a solid 10 minutes off my commute. But its value was so much more than that. During the day, these arteries were harmless, pulsing with the life of the neighborhood. They were chaotic and vibrant. Kids, their school uniforms slightly disheveled, would be kicking a scuffed-up soccer ball against a brick wall, their shouts echoing in the narrow space. Grandmas with impossibly strong backs would be hanging laundry on lines strung between buildings. The clean, soapy scent of detergent momentarily overwhelming the smell of garlic and gochujang drifting from a nearby window. Delivery bikes, driven by fearless young men, would roar past with a high-pitched whine, their engines a constant urban soundtrack. The air was thick with the sounds and smells of life being lived, the sizzle of cooking oil, the muffled dialogue from a television drama, the clatter of dishes being washed. It was a world away from the monastic silence of the library. It was real. But after midnight, they were transformed. The shortcuts became a different world entirely, a liminal space suspended between the sleeping apartments. They were empty, utterly and completely empty. The vibrant, chaotic life of the day was gone, and what remained was a landscape of shadows and whispers. The laundry lines, now bare, looked like spiderwebs catching the faint, orange glow of a distant streetlight. The concrete walls, stained with years of rain and pollution, seemed to close in, their peeling paint like the skin of some ancient creature. The narrow alleys, which felt cozy and bustling in the sunlight, now seemed to stretch into infinite, dark tunnels. I learned the cartography of this nocturnal world by heart. I knew which metal gate squeaked and which one was silent. I knew the exact spot where a puddle always formed after it rained, reflecting the moon in a distorted sliver of light. I knew which back stairways were lit by a single, flickering fluorescent bulb that cast long, dancing shadows, and which were plunged into absolute blackness, forcing me to trail my hand along the cold, damp concrete wall to guide myself. Sometimes, a thick fog would roll in from the river, clinging to the low-lying areas of my route, muffling sound and making the world feel soft, intimate, and deeply mysterious. My own footsteps were the only percussion in the profound silence. The soft scuff of my sneakers on asphalt, a comforting rhythm in the stillness. And I was proud of knowing them. It was a small, almost childish pride, but it was potent. In a life that felt increasingly dictated by academic syllabi and societal expectations, this was my rebellion. It made me feel like I'd hacked the city, while my peers were trudging along the designated, well-lit paths. I was moving through the city's hidden grammar, its secret passages. I wasn't just a student walking home. I was an urban explorer, a cartographer of the forgotten spaces. This knowledge set me apart. It was a silent, intimate relationship between me and the sleeping city. I felt like I knew its true face, the one it only showed after the sun went down and the masks of the day were removed. This quiet, empty world was mine. And in it, I wasn't just another drowning student. I was the one who knew the way. The city had a way of breathing in the autumn. When the fog rolled in from the harbour, it wasn't a gentle mist. It was a thick, wet blanket that smothered streetlights and muffled the world into a muted grey dreamscape. It swallowed sounds, distorted distances, and made the familiar streets feel like the corridors of a forgotten place. It was on a Tuesday, drowned in that very same fog, that the haunting began. It started not with a bang or a terrifying visage, but with the most human of sounds. Crying. It was a small, unsettling detail, a single frayed thread in the tapestry of my daily routine, but it was enough to begin unraveling everything. I was taking the shortcut home, through the labyrinthine service alleys behind the old textile district. The sound drifted down from an external iron staircase, a rusty spine clinging to the brick wall of a warehouse. It was the sound of soft, broken sobs, a lament so filled with grief it seemed to make the damp air heavier. My first instinct wasn't fear, but concern. It was a rational response. Someone was hurt, or lost, or had just received terrible news. My mind immediately supplied a dozen logical explanations for the sound, dismissing the strangeness of the location. I was just a passerby who happened to overhear a private moment of sorrow, but I couldn't just walk away. The sound was too raw, too compelling. I began to climb the slick metal steps, my hand sliding along the cold, wet railing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding flat and small in the oppressive fog. "Is everything all right up there?" The sobbing continued, a steady, heartbreaking rhythm. It drew me upward, 2 steps at a time, my heart beating with a mix of apprehension and civic duty. I reached the landing, a small platform in front of a heavy, locked metal door, and just as my foot touched the surface, the crying stopped, not faded, not tapered off. It ceased instantly, as if a switch had been flipped, plunging the landing into an abrupt and profound silence. The only sounds left were my own ragged breaths and the distant, mournful horn of a ship in the harbour. There was no one there, just the locked door, streaked with rust, and a neat pile of rain-dampened delivery boxes stacked against the wall. For the audience of my life, the unseen watchers, this was a clear and obvious warning. The lure, the abrupt silence, the isolation, it was a textbook opening to a story they knew I shouldn't be in. But for me, in that moment, it was merely a bizarre and unresolved event. I rationalized it away. The person must have heard me coming and slipped inside. Or perhaps the sound wasn't coming from the landing at all, but from an open window on the floor above. The acoustics of the alley playing tricks on me. I stood there for a full minute, listening to the silence, before shaking my head and continuing on my way home, chalking it up to the strange, sad mysteries of city life. The next night, the fog was even denser, and I chose a different route, a parallel alley 1 block over. It was a conscious decision, a small, unspoken admission that the previous night's event had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. This new path was narrower, flanked by towering brick walls that seemed to lean in, creating a canyon of echoing quiet. And then I heard it again. It was another small, unsettling detail, but its repetition transformed it from a random occurrence into a pattern. The exact same soft, broken sobs, carrying the same weight of unbearable sorrow. This time, they weren't coming from above, but seemed to emanate from the mouth of a darkened side alley ahead, a black rectangle cut into the grey fog. My initial reaction was a flash of irritation. Was this some kind of prank, or was I just incredibly unlucky, stumbling upon grieving strangers 2 nights in a row? I ignored it. I told myself it was a coincidence, that in a city of millions, human misery was a constant, ambient noise. I rationalized that old buildings have thin walls, that sounds travel in unpredictable ways, that it was none of my business. But my pace quickened. My steps became more deliberate, more urgent. The audience, of course, would see this for what it was. The second warning, a confirmation that the sound wasn't attached to a place, but was now attached to me. It was following me. My rationalizations were becoming weaker, the excuses thinner. I was no longer a concerned citizen. I was becoming prey, and my subconscious knew it, even if my conscious mind refused to accept the truth. By the third night, I was actively avoiding the service alleys altogether, sticking to the main streets where the streetlights, though haloed and indistinct in the fog, offered a semblance of safety. I walked with my head down, my shoulders hunched, trying to make myself a smaller target for whatever strange sorrow haunted this part of the city. It was then that the third sign appeared, the most unnerving one yet. It was the footsteps. This wasn't a vague sound in the distance. It was immediate and personal. It was the wet slap of a shoe on pavement, just slightly out of sync with my own. When my right foot fell, the other sound would follow a fraction of a second later. Left, then thwack. Right, then thwack. It was a small, unsettling detail, a sound so close it felt like it was inside my own head. My first thought was that it was an echo, a perfectly logical, scientific explanation. The high walls, the dense, humid air. It was the perfect environment for sound to bounce back, to test the theory. I stopped dead in my tracks. The footsteps stopped with me. The silence rushed back in, heavy and waiting. The audience would be screaming at me now. They would know that echoes don't work like that. An echo is a trailing, fading thing. It doesn't stop with such perfect, intelligent precision. It was a warning klaxon, a clear sign that I was not alone, that something was mimicking me, pacing me, walking in my shadow, but I clung to my logic. I started walking again, slowly this time. The second set of footsteps returned, a perfect, delayed mirror of my own. I sped up, and they sped up with me. I was trying to outrun my own echo, a frantic, desperate act of denial. I told myself I was tired, that the stress was getting to me, that I was letting the fog and the crying spook me into a state of heightened paranoia. I didn't dare look back. I was too afraid that my rationalization would shatter completely, that I would turn and see nothing there, confirming that the sound was not a trick of physics, but a product of the impossible. From then on, the walk home became a nightly ordeal, a journey through a landscape of escalating dread. The crying continued, sometimes near, sometimes far, a mournful soundtrack to my fear. The footsteps became my constant, unwanted companion. Then came the smell. It would arrive without warning, a faint, cloying scent that caught in the back of my throat. It was the smell of damp, turned over earth, of wilted flowers left too long in a vase, and underneath it all, a faint, coppery tang, like old, wet pennies. It was another small, unsettling detail that my mind scrambled to explain away. It was just the smell of garbage from a nearby bin, or the discharge from a restaurant's drain pipe. I rationalized it as just another unpleasant byproduct of the urban environment. I ignored it, breathing through my mouth, trying to keep the foulness from my senses. But the audience would recognize the scent instantly. It is the universal perfume of the grave. It was the smell of decay, of death, the scent of the thing that was following me. It was a warning that this presence was not just an echo or a sound, but something that had once been physical and had left its mortal shell behind to rot. The final sign was the one that broke me. It was a Thursday, and the fog was so thick it felt like I was wading through water. The footsteps were there. The smell of decay was in the air, but I was trying to block it out, focusing only on the door to my apartment building 100 feet ahead. Then I saw it. A movement in my peripheral vision. It wasn't just the fog swirling, or a piece of paper caught in the wind. It was a tall, thin shape detaching itself from the deeper shadows of a recessed doorway. A small, yet profoundly terrifying detail. I didn't turn my head. I didn't dare look directly at it. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a distortion caused by the fog, my overtired mind finally cracking and manufacturing phantoms out of nothing. I kept my eyes locked on my destination, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But I had seen it. A flicker of movement that was too deliberate, too tall, too unnatural to be a product of chance. For the audience, this was the climax of the first act. The haunting had escalated from auditory to olfactory, and now, finally, to visual. The warning was no longer a subtle hint. It was a clear and present threat. It was the monster showing itself, stepping out from behind the curtain. For me, it was the end of all rationalization. It was the moment the floor gave out beneath my feet. I could no longer ignore the signs or explain them away. Something was wrong. Something was in the fog with me. And it was getting closer. The phenomenon began as a simple, ignorable quirk of the city's acoustics. My route home from the studio cut through a labyrinth of narrow alleyways and forgotten back streets. A concrete canyon where sound behaved strangely. At first, I barely registered it, the faint echo of my own footsteps. It was a common enough occurrence in such a place. The slap of my soles on wet pavement bouncing off brick walls and corrugated iron fences. But this echo was different. It had a peculiar, lazy quality to it, a consistent delay that felt less like a reflection of sound and more like a sluggish, unenthusiastic mimic. It was always a half beat behind, a syncopated rhythm that was just off enough to be unnerving. When I stopped, it stopped, but always 2 beats late, a final, ghostly tap-tap in the silence after I had already frozen still. Strange events repeat. For the first week, I dismissed it as a product of my tired mind, a side effect of long hours spent editing audio, where my brain was hyper-attuned to timing and rhythm. I tried to ignore it, putting in my earbuds and turning up the volume on my music. But I could still feel it, a subtle vibration through the soles of my shoes, a ghost beat that persisted just beneath the threshold of hearing. Curiosity soon gnawed at my rationalizations. I began to experiment, treating the nightly walk as a private, bizarre investigation. I tried changing my pace, breaking into a sudden, hurried walk. The echo followed, its tempo increasing to match mine, but always maintaining that maddening 2-beat delay. Then, I would slow to a crawl, each step deliberate and drawn out. The echo would slow as well, its phantom footfalls dragging across the concrete long after mine had landed. One evening, I tried a more complex pattern, 2 quick steps, a pause, 1 slow step, another pause, like a secret code tapped out for an audience of 1. In the echoing silence, the pattern was repeated back to me perfectly, but with that signature, infuriating lag. It was like a child's copying game, where the imitator is always just a moment behind the leader. The game became my obsession. I felt a strange compulsion to test its limits, to find the flaw in its mimicry. The irritation it initially caused was slowly being replaced by a thread of genuine unease. This wasn't just sound bouncing off walls. It felt too consistent, too intelligent. Intensity increases. The change came on a Tuesday night, thick with a damp, cold fog that clung to the streetlights in hazy halos. I was walking, my collar pulled up against the chill, listening to the familiar, delayed rhythm of my own passage. A cough, dry and sharp, scratched its way up my throat. I cleared it quickly. I took 2 more steps, then froze. 1 beat, 2 beats. From the oppressive silence of the alley ahead, a faint, dry rasp echoed back, an identical cough, disembodied and chillingly close. My blood went cold. This was no longer about footsteps. It was about me. The echo had graduated from my movements to my very physiology. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. For the rest of the walk, I held my breath, afraid to make a sound, afraid of what I might hear, repeated back to me. The delayed footsteps behind me felt different now, no longer a curious anomaly, but the deliberate pacing of a pursuer, a stalker who was toying with me, learning me. The 2-beat delay was no longer a flaw, it was a taunt. It was a declaration that it was separate from me, an independent entity shadowing my every move, my every sound, my every breath. No one else notices or believes I knew I sounded insane. I could hear it in my own voice as I spoke to Caleb on the phone the next day, the words tumbling out in a frantic, paranoid rush. It's following me, man, every night. It copies everything I do, but it's always late. An echo. Caleb's voice was patient, the kind you use on a scared child or a drunk friend. Leo, you work in the most ridiculously built-up part of the city. Of course, there are echoes. No, you don't get it, I insisted, pacing my small apartment. Last night, I coughed, and it coughed back, exactly the same, just a second later. How does a brick wall do that? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could picture him perfectly, pinching the bridge of his nose, wondering how to handle me. You've been working too hard, he said finally. You're barely sleeping. Your ears are probably playing tricks on you. Auditory pareidolia. It's a real thing. Your brain is creating patterns out of random noise. It's not random noise, I nearly shouted. It's real. I can prove it. That night, with Caleb on the line, I stepped back into the alley. Okay, are you listening? Quietly now. I held the phone out. The alley was silent except for the distant hum of traffic. I'm walking, I whispered. I took 5 distinct heavy steps. Clomp, 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 clomp. I stopped. The world held its breath. Then, faintly, 2 beats later, clomp, clomp. Did you hear that? I hissed into the phone. It missed the last 3. It's getting sloppy. Leo. Caleb's voice was strained with concern. I heard your 5 steps. Then I heard nothing, just you breathing really heavily. Are you okay? Maybe you should just take a taxi home tonight. He didn't hear it. He couldn't hear it. The crushing realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This thing, whatever it was for me and me alone. I was utterly, terrifyingly isolated in this experience, trapped in a bubble of sound that no one else could perceive. My own sanity was now a suspect. Frustration and a desperate, rising fear warred within me. I needed to force a confrontation. I needed to break the rules of this twisted game. That night, after hanging up with Caleb, a wild idea took root. An echo is a reflection. It can't act. It can only react. It can't innovate. So, I would do something it couldn't possibly copy in the same way. One night, I walked backward. I turned around, facing the way I had come, and began to slowly, deliberately, put one foot behind the other. The motion felt clumsy, unnatural. I counted my steps aloud under my breath. 1, 2, 3. I kept my ears strained, listening for the delayed, backward shuffle. But there was nothing. The echo didn't. It kept going forward. Then it stopped. The synchronized movement was broken. For the first time, the sound had deviated from my own actions. My phantom follower had stopped somewhere in the darkness ahead of me, exactly where I should have been if I had continued walking normally. The silence that followed was profound, heavier, and more menacing than any sound it had ever made. That's when I heard breathing, right in front of me. It wasn't my own ragged, panicked gasps. It was a slow, measured, impossibly cold sound. An inhale that seemed to draw all the warmth from the air, and an exhale that smelled of damp earth and decay. It was inches from my face. I could feel the slight disturbance in the air against my skin. My hand trembled as I fumbled for my phone, my thumb swiping desperately across the screen. I turned on my flashlight. Mini climax. 1. The beam of white light sliced through the oppressive darkness. A sudden, harsh blade of clarity. It illuminated an empty alley. Wet concrete glistened under the artificial light, reflecting the grimy brick of the opposing wall. Steam curled from a sewer grate. There was no one there. A wave of dizzying relief washed over me. It was in my head. Caleb was right. It was all in my head. But beside my shadow was another one. My own was a solid, dark shape cast on the round behind me. A perfect silhouette. But next to it lay a second shadow, born from no visible source. It was wrong in every conceivable way. It was longer, stretched out as if cast by a body impossibly tall. It was thinner, a mere sliver of black, an inky gash on the pavement. And it was moving, while my shadow was perfectly still. A static copy of my frozen form. This other one writhed slowly, its edges curling like smoke, its form subtly elongating and contracting on its own. As I watched, paralyzed by a horror that stole the air from my lungs, one of its impossibly thin arms lifted from the ground, reaching, pointing directly at me. My own arms remained pinned to my sides. The phenomenon began as a simple, ignorable quirk of the city's acoustics. My route home from the studio cut through a labyrinth of narrow alleyways and forgotten back streets. A concrete canyon where sound behaved strangely. At first, I barely registered it. The faint echo of my own footsteps. It was a common enough occurrence in such a place. The slap of my soles on wet pavement bouncing off brick walls and corrugated iron fences. But this echo was different. It had a peculiar, lazy quality to it, a consistent delay that felt less like a reflection of sound and more like a sluggish, unenthusiastic mimic. It was always a half beat behind, a syncopated rhythm that was just off enough to be unnerving. When I stopped, it stopped, but always 2 beats late. A final, ghostly tap-tap in the silence after I'd already frozen still. Strange events repeat. For the first week, I dismissed it as a product of my tired mind, a side effect of long hours spent editing audio, where my brain was hyper-attuned to timing and rhythm. I tried to ignore it, putting in my earbuds and turning up the volume on my music, but I could still feel it, a subtle vibration through the soles of my shoes, a ghost beat that persisted just beneath the threshold of hearing. Curiosity soon gnawed at my rationalizations. I began to experiment, treating the nightly walk as a private, bizarre investigation. I tried changing my pace, breaking into a sudden, hurried walk. The echo followed, its tempo increasing to match mine, but always maintaining that maddening 2-beat delay. Then, I would slow to a crawl, each step deliberate and drawn out. The echo would slow as well, its phantom footfalls dragging across the concrete long after mine had landed. One evening, I tried a more complex pattern. 2 quick steps, a pause, 1 slow step, another pause, like a secret code tapped out for an audience of 1. In the echoing silence, the pattern was repeated back to me perfectly, but with that signature, infuriating lag. It was like a child's copying game, where the imitator is always just a moment behind the leader. The game became my obsession. I felt a strange compulsion to test its limits, to find the flaw in its mimicry. The irritation it initially caused was slowly being replaced by a thread of genuine unease. This wasn't just sound bouncing off walls. It felt too consistent, too intelligent. Intensity increases. The change came on a Tuesday night, thick with a damp, cold fog that clung to the streetlights in hazy halos. I was walking, my collar pulled up against the chill, listening to the familiar, delayed rhythm of my own passage. A cough, dry and sharp, scratched its way up my throat. I cleared it quickly. I took 2 more steps, then froze. 1 beat, 2 beats. From the oppressive silence of the alley ahead, a faint, dry rasp echoed back, an identical cough, disembodied and chillingly close. My blood went cold. This was no longer about footsteps. It was about me. The echo had graduated from my movements to my very physiology. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. For the rest of the walk, I held my breath, afraid to make a sound, afraid of what I might hear repeated back to me. The delayed footsteps behind me felt different now, no longer a curious anomaly, but the deliberate pacing of a pursuer, a stalker who was toying with me, learning me. The 2-beat delay was no longer a flaw. It was a taunt. It was a declaration that it was separate from me, an independent entity shadowing my every move, my every sound, my every breath. No one else notices or believes. I knew I sounded insane. I could hear it in my own voice as I spoke to Caleb on the phone the next day, the words tumbling out in a frantic, paranoid rush. It's following me, man, every night. It copies everything I do, but it's always late. An echo. Caleb's voice was patient, the kind you use on a scared child or a drunk friend. Leo, you work in the most ridiculously built-up part of the city. Of course, there are echoes. No, you don't get it, I insisted, pacing my small apartment. Last night, I coughed, and it coughed back, exactly the same, just a second later. How does a brick wall do that? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could picture him perfectly, pinching the bridge of his nose, wondering how to handle me. You've been working too hard, he said finally. You're barely sleeping. Your ears are probably playing tricks on you. Auditory pareidolia. It's a real thing. Your brain is creating patterns out of random noise. It's not random noise, I nearly shouted. It's real, I can prove it. That night, with Caleb on the line, I stepped back into the alley. Okay, are you listening? Quietly now. I held the phone out. The alley was silent, except for the distant hum of traffic. I'm walking, I whispered. I took 5 distinct, heavy steps. Clomp, 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 clomp. I stopped. The world held its breath. Then, faintly, 2 beats later, clomp, clomp. Did you hear that? I hissed into the phone. It missed the last 3. It's getting sloppy. Leo. Caleb's voice was strained with concern. I heard your 5 steps. Then I heard nothing. Just you breathing really heavily. Are you okay? Maybe you should just take a taxi home tonight. He didn't hear it. He couldn't hear it. The crushing realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This thing, whatever it was for me and me alone. I was utterly, terrifyingly isolated in this experience, trapped in a bubble of sound that no one else could perceive. My own sanity was now a suspect. Frustration and a desperate rising fear warred within me. I needed to force a confrontation. I needed to break the rules of this twisted game. That night, after hanging up with Caleb, a wild idea took root. An echo is a reflection. It can't act. It can only react. It can't innovate. So, I would do something it couldn't possibly copy in the same way. One night, I walked backward. I turned around, facing the way I had come, and began to slowly, deliberately, put one foot behind the other. The motion felt clumsy, unnatural. I counted my steps aloud under my breath. 1, 2, 3. I kept my ears strained, listening for the delayed, backward shuffle. But there was nothing. The echo didn't. It kept going forward. Then it stopped. The synchronized movement was broken. For the first time, the sound had deviated from my own actions. My phantom follower had stopped somewhere in the darkness ahead of me, exactly where I should have been if I had continued walking normally. The silence that followed was profound, heavier and more menacing than any sound it had ever made. That's when I heard breathing, right in front of me. It wasn't my own ragged, panicked gasps. It was a slow, measured, impossibly cold sound. An inhale that seemed to draw all the warmth from the air, and an exhale that smelled of damp earth and decay. It was inches from my face. I could feel the slight disturbance in the air against my skin. My hand trembled as I fumbled for my phone, my thumb swiping desperately across the screen. I turned on my flashlight. Mini climax. 1. The beam of white light sliced through the oppressive darkness, a sudden, harsh blade of clarity. It illuminated an empty alley. Wet concrete glistened under the artificial light, reflecting the grimy brick of the opposing wall. Steam curled from a sewer grate. There was no one there. A wave of dizzying relief washed over me. It was in my head. Caleb was right. It was all in my head. But beside my shadow was another one. My own was a solid, dark shape cast on the ground behind me. A perfect silhouette. But next to it lay a second shadow, born from no visible source. It was wrong in every conceivable way. It was longer, stretched out as if cast by a body impossibly tall. It was thinner, a mere sliver of black, an inky gash on the pavement, and it was moving, while my shadow was perfectly still, a static copy of my frozen form. This other one writhed slowly, its edges curling like smoke, its form subtly elongating and contracting on its own. As I watched, paralyzed by a horror that stole the air from my lungs, one of its impossibly thin arms lifted from the ground, reaching, pointing directly at me. My own arms remained pinned to my sides. For weeks, I had been living in a state of low-grade, simmering anxiety, a pot left on the stove that never quite boils, but always threatens to. I told myself it was stress. My job had been demanding, a relentless series of deadlines and high-pressure meetings that left me feeling hollowed out by the end of the day. My apartment, usually a sanctuary, had started to feel porous. I'd hear things, faint whispers that sounded like my name being spoken through a wall, the scrape of a chair from the empty apartment above, echoes of footsteps on the stairs long after my neighbours had settled in for the night. I blamed the old building's acoustics, the wind whistling through unseen cracks in the window frames, my own exhausted imagination playing tricks on me. It was easier to believe I was fraying at the edges than to consider the alternative. The little visual glitches were easier to dismiss, too, a shadow in my peripheral vision that would vanish when I turned to face it. The flicker of a reflection in a dark window that didn't quite match my own movement. It was all explainable. It had to be. Fatigue can do strange things to the mind. I reasoned. It can create ghosts where there are only drafts and phantoms, where there is only loneliness. I clung to logic like a man overboard clings to a piece of driftwood, desperately paddling toward the shores of sanity, even as the current pulled me further out into a cold, dark sea of doubt. Until the night I saw her, the rain had been falling all day, a miserable, persistent drizzle that soaked the city in a sheen of grey. It was late when I finally left the office, the streets mostly deserted, the glow of the streetlights bleeding into shimmering, distorted halos on the wet pavement. The air was thick and cold, each breath a plume of white vapour. I walked with my head down, shoulders hunched against the chill, my mind already on the warmth of my apartment, a hot meal, and the blessed oblivion of sleep. The entrance to my building felt different that night. The single bare bulb that usually cast a sickly yellow light over the lobby was flickering erratically, plunging the small space into moments of deep shadow before sputtering back to life. The silence was heavier than usual, the city's hum muffled as if a thick blanket had been thrown over the world. A primal, instinctual part of my brain screamed at me to turn around, to go anywhere else. But my legs, driven by the mundane autopilot of routine, carried me forward, through the lobby, and to the bottom of the concrete stairwell. That's when the feeling washed over me, a sudden, dizzying wave of absolute dread. The air became instantly, unnaturally cold, clinging to my skin with a damp chill that had nothing to do with the rain. My breath hitched in my chest, every nerve ending fizzed with alarm. The feeling of being watched, an unnerving sensation I had grown accustomed to in fleeting moments, was now an oppressive, suffocating certainty. It was coming from above, from the stairs, slowly, reluctantly. I began to climb. My hand trembled as I reached for the cold, metal railing. Each step I took seemed to echo unnaturally in the enclosed space. The soft scuff of my shoes amplified into deafening reports. 1 flight, 2. The feeling grew stronger with every step, a magnetic pull of pure malevolence from the floor below. I paused on the 3rd floor landing, my own floor, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My keys were in my hand, the metal digging into my sweaty palm. Just a few more feet to my door. Safety. But a morbid, terrible curiosity rooted me to the spot. Where was this feeling coming from? My gaze was drawn downwards, back the way I had come, into the poorly lit well of the staircase. I leaned slightly over the railing, peering into the gloom, and I saw her. She was crouched at the very bottom of the stairs, on the concrete floor where I had stood only moments before. The sight was so wrong, so fundamentally incorrect, that my brain struggled to process it. It was like looking at a broken doll, a human shape folded in ways it was never meant to fold. Her body was bent forward at an impossible angle. Her spine curved into a grotesque arc that should have snapped it in two. Her limbs were splayed, her joints twisted backward. She was utterly still, a macabre sculpture of flesh and bone. Her long black hair, matted and wet, was not just touching the damp pavement. It was spread across it, sweeping out from her head like a pool of dark ink. For a frozen eternity, all I could do was stare, my mind trying to build a logical framework around the impossible tableau before me. A homeless person seeking shelter, an accident, but the wrongness of it all, the sheer physical impossibility of her posture, dismantled every rational explanation. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing down as my focus narrowed on the figure. My own breathing sounded distant, a roaring wind in my ears that mingled with the faint patter of the rain outside. Then, as if she could feel my gaze on her, she began to move. It was a slow, deliberate motion. She didn't stand. She uncoiled. Her head, which had been tucked down against her chest, lifted. It rose with a series of tiny, sickening clicks, like a ratchet turning, one vertebra at a time. As her head came up, her face was revealed in the flickering, intermittent light from the lobby bulb. And my world shattered. It wasn't a face. It was a parody of one, like a photograph of a person that had been digitally stretched and distorted by a cruel artist. Her skin was pulled taut, unnaturally smooth and pale. But the smile tore past the boundaries of humanity. It was a wide black gash that ripped from one side of her face to the other, stretching her mouth into a horrifying crescent that reached far beyond her cheeks, pulling the skin so tight it looked like it might tear. There were no lips, only a dark, cavernous line filled with too many teeth. When she looked up, her eyes met mine. They weren't eyes. They were two black, empty holes, voids of absolute nothingness that seemed to drink the light from the stairwell. There was no reflection in them, no spark of life, only a profound and terrifying emptiness that felt like it was pulling the very light out of the world, out of me. I felt a piece of my soul begin to fray and unravel, drawn into that infinite, hungry darkness. She smiled. The stretched, torn gash on her face widened by a fraction. A low, wet, clicking sound echoed up the stairs. And in that moment, the dam of my fear broke. A scream built in my throat, but it died before it could escape, strangled by pure terror. My body, which had been frozen, finally unlocked. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I reacted. I spun around, my keys clattering from my numb fingers, and I ran. I scrambled up the last few stairs to my landing, fumbling blindly for the doorknob, my mind a white-hot blank of panic. Behind me, I heard a sound, a wet, dragging scrape, the sound of something impossibly heavy being pulled across the concrete. The sound of her moving. I didn't dare look back. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very marrow, that if I saw her again, I would not survive it. I abandoned the idea of my apartment, of safety, and launched myself back down the opposite side of the stairwell, taking the steps 2, 3 at a time, my feet slamming against the concrete, the impacts jarring my bones. The scraping sound was faster now, closer. I could feel the coldness chasing me, a wave of absolute dread at my heels. I burst out of the stairwell, through the flickering lobby, and back out into the night, the cold rain a shocking slap against my face. I just kept running, my lungs burning, my frantic footsteps splashing through the puddles, leaving the building and the impossible thing within it far behind me. I ran until the city lights blurred into a meaningless smear of colour, and the only sound I could hear was the blood pounding in my own ears. I don't know how long I ran, or where I ended up, but I know this. I'm telling you this story so that you know, so that you'll believe me. If you've ever felt that chill, that sense of being watched when you're alone, don't ignore it. Don't rationalize it. Run. If this story helped you, or if you've seen her too, leave a comment below. Subscribe for more updates, because I'm afraid this isn't over. The first sound was the only warning I needed. A wet, slick drag against pavement, like a sodden sack of meat being pulled across the stones. My blood went cold. My feet were moving before my brain had fully processed the command. Instinct screaming at me to run, to get out, to not look back. The alleys that once felt like home, a secret network of shortcuts and quiet places I had mapped since childhood, became a trap. Every familiar wall, every graffiti-tagged shutter, twisted into a feature of a tightening cage, and I was the panicked animal rattling against its bars. I sprinted, my breath tearing from my lungs in raw, ragged gasps. The air was thick with the smell of damp refuse and stale cooking oil, a scent I'd never noticed before but now felt was choking me. My path was a frantic, muscle memory dance I'd performed 1,000 times, left at the overflowing dumpster, right at the wall with the faded dragon mural, then up the crumbling concrete steps by the old pharmacy, its windows boarded over like dead eyes. Each footfall was a desperate drumbeat against the silence, a frantic prayer for speed. But it wasn't silent behind me. That sound followed. That awful, rhythmic, slither drag. It was a sound that defied physics, a weight that moved with a sickening lightness. It didn't fade or fall behind. It kept pace, a relentless, wet metronome counting down the seconds of my life. I risked a glance over my shoulder as I scrambled through the small, deserted plaza, and my heart seized. She wasn't running, she wasn't walking or even crawling. She was sliding. Her body, a pale and elongated horror, flowed over the cobblestones like a river of spoiled milk, a contortionist's nightmare given malevolent life. It moved in a way that was fundamentally wrong, her form twisting as if it didn't have bones, a fluid sack of gristle and hate. Her head was tilted at an impossible 90-degree angle, her dark matted hair scraping the ground, her vacant eyes fixed on me from a sideways, predatory stare, her arms, stretched impossibly long, scraped along the brick walls on either side of the alley, not for balance, but as if to feel her way through the narrow space, to taste the very air I was disturbing. Her long, grey fingers, tipped with what looked like shattered black nails, clawed at the concrete, digging shallow grooves in the stone and leaving thin, dark streaks of something viscous behind. The sound was her, the wet noise of her flesh peeling and resealing against the rough ground with every forward surge. Panic became a liquid fire in my veins. My mind emptied of everything but the route. Up the stairs, through the plaza, past the shuttered butcher shop, hang a sharp right. My worn sneakers slipped on a patch of slick moss, and I went down hard. Pain exploded in my knee and the palms of my hands as they slapped against the gritty pavement. For a split second, I lay there, stunned, the air knocked out of me. The dragging sound stopped. A new sound replaced it. A low, guttural clicking, like 1,000 wet pebbles being rolled around in a desiccated throat. It was closer, so much closer. I scrambled up, ignoring the searing pain, grit and blood grinding into my palms. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. The image was already burned onto the inside of my eyelids, the sideways head, the boneless flow, the clawed fingers. To see it again would be to surrender. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. I could see it ahead, a shimmering, hazy glow filtering in at the end of the narrow passage. Neon lights, the main road. It was the promise of normal life, of crowds and cars and light. It was safety. It was salvation. The hope gave my legs a final, desperate burst of strength. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, a dark throat trying to swallow me whole before I could reach the teeth. The dragging sound quickened behind me, turning into a frantic, wet thrashing. She knew I was close to escaping. I could feel a coldness radiating from behind, a palpable aura of ancient hunger. I threw myself forward, a guttural sob escaping my lips, and burst out of the mouth of the alleyway, stumbling into the blinding, chaotic symphony of the city street. I collapsed against the cool metal of a traffic light pole, my body a trembling, useless wreck. The world spun in a dizzying wash of red tail lights, glowing shop signs, and the indifferent faces of strangers. Cars honked. Music blared from a nearby bar. A group of friends laughed as they walked past, their conversation a meaningless buzz in my ears. I was back in the world, but I was no longer a part of it. My chest heaved, each breath a painful, shuddering intake. My hands were raw, bleeding and embedded with gravel. My right knee was a throbbing, swollen knot of pure agony. But those were just surface wounds, trivial and clean. The real injuries were the ones no one could see. The mental scars were already forming, jagged and deep. I couldn't close my eyes without seeing her unnatural, fluid movement. I couldn't quiet my mind without hearing that hideous, wet, dragging sound. It was an echo now, a ghost in my ears that I knew would never truly fade. I kept looking back at the dark, gaping more of the alley, expecting to see her pale form spill out onto the pavement, her head cocked sideways in that soul-shattering way. But there was nothing, just darkness, an ordinary, empty alley. Yet I knew it wasn't empty. She was in there, or worse, she could be anywhere. The very concept of shadow and darkness had been rewritten for me. No longer a simple absence of light, but a potential hiding place for boneless things that slide. I felt a profound, chilling sense of having barely survived. This wasn't a victory. It was a stay of execution. I hadn't fought back. I had only run. I had scraped through by the thinnest of margins. A mouse that had wriggled free from the snake's jaws just before they snapped shut, but was now left bleeding and terrified in the open. The safety of the bustling street felt like a lie, a thin, fragile veneer painted over a world of horrors I now knew existed just beneath the surface. I looked at the people around me, living their lives, completely oblivious to the thing that hunted in the darkness just a few feet away. I was an alien among them, a visitor from a terrible other country. I had escaped the place. Yes, I had abandoned that labyrinth of alleys forever. But the maze was now inside me. The physical wounds would heal into faint white lines on my skin. But the memory of her, of that impossible, sliding chase, had clawed its own permanent, bleeding streaks across my soul. I had survived, but I was not safe, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than any alley's darkness, that I would never be whole again. The snap was not a sound that travelled through the air to my ears. It was a sound that happened inside my skull, a sharp, crystalline fracture of reality itself. It was the sound of a taut string being cut, and I was the one who came loose. The world, the solid, gritty, real world of the street below, with its yellow taxis and indifferent pedestrians, did not vanish. It receded. The pressure on my neck from those impossibly long, cold fingers didn't increase. Instead, the coldness bloomed, flooding my entire being not with the chill of winter, but with the absolute final cold of a place where heat has never existed. The hand on my shoulder felt less like a physical touch and more like an anchor, holding me in place as the tide of the living world pulled away. The vibrant colours of the city muted to a palette of greys and faded sepias. The cacophony of traffic and life dwindled to a distant, muffled hum, like listening to a city from the bottom of a deep ocean. My scream died in my throat, turning into a soundless puff of vapor in a world that no longer had temperature. I was trapped between heartbeats in the silent space between the ticks of a clock, slowly, with the dreamlike inevitability of a nightmare. I turned my head. There was no monster. There was no snarling ghoul or contorted face of rage. There was only a man, or the ghost of one. He was tall and terribly thin, a silhouette of sorrow sketched in shades of grey. He wore the simple, slightly threadbare clothes of another era, a plain button-down shirt, dark trousers held up by suspenders. His face was all sharp angles and hollows, dominated by wide, dark eyes that held no malice, only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. And his hands, his fingers were long, yes, unnaturally so. They were the delicate, spidery fingers of a watchmaker or a neurosurgeon, extended by decades of desperate phantom searching. He was not looking at me, but through me, at something I couldn't see. The hand on my shoulder was not a gesture of aggression, but of connection. It was the only way he knew how to say, "Stay. Listen." He released me, and the spectral cold receded to a bearable hum. He turned and began to drift back up the stairs, his feet not quite touching the steps. He didn't look back, but I felt a gentle, irresistible pull to follow. The 20 steps to the street might as well have been a million miles away now. My escape was a forgotten dream. The only way out, I understood with a sudden, chilling certainty, was through his story. As I followed him up the decaying staircase, the building began to change around me. The grime and dust on the walls thinned and vanished. The peeling paint grew smooth and whole. The water stains on the ceiling dried up and disappeared. The spectral silence was filled by a new sound. A sound I had heard before in faint, maddening whispers throughout the building. Ticking. First one, then a dozen, then 100. A symphony of ticking clocks, from the slow, deep thud of a grandfather clock to the frantic, insect-like chatter of a tiny pocket watch. It wasn't a countdown to doom. It was the sound of a life's work. The source of the faint, metallic smell I'd occasionally caught now made sense. It wasn't the scent of decay or blood, but of machine oil and brass polish. We reached the top floor, the one where the cold had been most intense. The door to the apartment at the end of the hall, the one that had been nailed shut, was now a rich, dark wood, a small brass plate on it reading, S. Blackwood, horologist. The ghost, Silas Blackwood, passed through the solid door. The psychic pull intensified, and I reached out, my hand trembling. My fingers met not wood, but a shimmering cold mist. I pushed through and stepped into the past. Backstory of the ghost event, plus revealed by witness, document, ritual. The room was no longer an empty, derelict space. It was a workshop, filled with light from the large window that now looked out onto a street, bustling with vintage cars and people in hats. Every surface was covered in clocks. Grandfather clocks stood like sentinels against the walls. Mantel clocks crowded the shelves. The tables were a beautiful chaos of tools, magnifying loops, and the intricate, gleaming guts of timepieces in various states of assembly. The air buzzed with their collective, rhythmic life. And in the centre of it all sat a younger Silas Blackwood. He was still thin, but his face was animated with fierce concentration and a brilliant, obsessive light in his eyes. He was bent over a device of incredible complexity. It was a clock, but more than a clock. It was a sphere of interlocking brass and silver rings, covered in dials and studded with tiny gems that seemed to drink the light. This was his masterpiece. I was not a participant, merely an observer. I was the witness to this spectral ritual, forced to watch the memories imprinted on this space. I saw Silas work, his long, deft fingers flying as he assembled the device with a surgeon's precision. I saw him barely eat, pushing aside plates of food brought by a worried-looking landlord. I saw him ignore letters that piled up on his desk, the outside world ceasing to exist. His entire universe was contained in this room, in the delicate dance of gears and springs. This was his passion, his art, his madness. Then, the vision shifted. The light outside the window dimmed. Years seemed to pass in moments. Silas was gaunter, the light in his eyes now frantic, feverish. His masterpiece was nearly complete. He was fitting the final piece, a gear no bigger than a grain of rice, the escapement that would regulate the entire, impossibly complex mechanism. His hands, once steady, now trembled with fatigue and caffeine. And it happened. The tiny, crucial gear slipped from his tweezers. It bounced once on the tabletop, a minuscule glint of brass, and fell to the floor, disappearing into the dark wooden floorboards. Silas froze. The symphony of ticking clocks seemed to fall silent, leaving only the frantic beating of his own heart. He dropped to his knees, his long fingers patting the floor, then scratching, searching. All earlier clues now make sense. A jolt went through me, an electric shock of understanding. The scratches, the gouges I had seen in the floorboards and along the baseboards on this floor. They weren't from an animal. They weren't from a victim trying to claw their way out. They were from him, from Silas, desperately searching for the heart of his life's work. The vision accelerated. I saw him spend days, then weeks, on the floor. He pried at the floorboards with his tools, his elegant fingers becoming raw and bloody. The ticking of the other clocks became a maddening chorus, mocking his failure. The cold I had felt in this room was not the cold of death, but the cold of utter, soul-crushing despair. He had lost everything in that single, clumsy moment. He never finished the clock. He never left the room. He died there, on the floor, of starvation, dehydration, and a broken heart. His hands still outstretched, his long fingers reaching into a crack between the boards. His spirit became anchored to the building, trapped in an eternal, looping search. The long, cold fingers that had touched my shoulder were a spectral echo of that final, desperate gesture. He wasn't reaching for me to harm me. He was reaching for the gear. He was still searching. The vision faded. The workshop dissolved back into dust and ruin. The symphony of ticking clocks dwindled until only one sound remained, a faint, ghostly tick-tock, out of sync with reality. I was alone in the derelict apartment again, with the spectral grey form of Silas Blackwood standing by the window. He turned his head and looked at me. For the first time, I felt truly seen. His dark, exhausted eyes met mine, and in their depths, I saw a plea. He had shown me his story. He had made me understand. But the revelation was not a key. It was a shared prison. Now I knew his pain, and in knowing, I was now a part of it. The hand on my shoulder had been a plea for a witness, and now that I had witnessed his tragedy, I could feel the cold settling into my bones, anchoring me to this place, just as he was. The street below was a world away, and I realized the front door was no longer my exit. I was trapped in time, with a ghost who had lost it. What do you think truly happened to Min Jun? Was it a tragic accident on a slippery staircase, or was he pulled to his death by something far more sinister? In Korea, there's a powerful cultural concept called Han. It's more than just sadness or anger. It's a deep, collective feeling of unresolved injustice, sorrow, and resentment that lingers for generations. When a person dies with intense, personal Han, their spirit can become a gwizin, a ghost tethered to the physical world by its overwhelming regrets and desire for vengeance. The ghost of the Bongcheon-dong staircase is a chilling embodiment of Han, its pain so profound that it lashes out, creating an endless cycle of tragedy. It's a haunting reminder that some grudges are so deep, not even death can erase them. Do you believe a spirit's sorrow can become this deadly? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you want to explore more dark legends from across Asia, subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the chilling stories we're unearthing next.